Hey everyone, welcome to this week 9 of the semester. I'm Professor Rios. Hope you're doing well. This week, Google Earth comes in really handy, more so than other weeks, simply because it's really easy to see bio regions and ecosystems on Google Earth. The shading differences, like for example, from dark green to light brown and so on, really helps you to see the global circulation system. The fact that west winds are bringing moisture like down here, yet here the winds are out of the mountains, so they're from this direction. So you get to see where the green is versus where the brown is and how it changes with latitude. So that's kind of interesting, but you can also see the different biomes, like for example, when you go over to Africa. And you really go from green at the very, very tip to brown, back to green, back to brown, and so on. So Africa is another really good example. So I highly recommend that you take a good look through Google Earth. It helps you to visualize some of this information, I think, quite well. All right. So back to the lesson. So week 9, let's sort of put it into perspective here. Bioregions and biogeography and ecosystems. This image here, I love this image simply because it shows obviously a very dark rainy sky in the distance, but you see the fact that is grass with a few trees. So clearly this climate is one that supports some vegetation, but not a tropical jungle. This is in Africa, so if you travel much further north, you'll get to the desert. So you won't even see one tree. And if you travel further south, it becomes a lot greener. So that is how you can use Google Earth to sort of take a trip through these different bioregions. So the objectives: understanding the difference between biodiversity, and biogeography. What defining net primary productivity, where it is, where it tends to be highest, and so on. What's the difference between photosynthesis and respiration? And I think most people get photosynthesis, but respiration is frankly the opposite of it. And you need to understand what the difference between the two happens to be. Explain biomes as defined by climate. Remember the A, B, C, D, E climate classification system, and how biomes and MPP are related to one another. So these are some of the important terms of the lesson that are, and by the way, just let you know that we will address this again next lesson in some sort of review sort of fashion. These lessons begin to kind of interrelate and tie to one another pretty well, so bear that in mind. Here's the difference between the definitions: biogeography, so the study of distribution of living things and how they change over time. We're going to focus primarily on plant life in this course. So if this was a year-long physical geography course, we might do both. But as a function of time, we're going to focus on the terrestrial ecosystems. And biosphere is the totality of plants and animal in a place. We're going to focus again on the flora, not the fauna, which is the animal life. So if you look at population, human population, it took about, the first billion was approximately in 1804, the next billion in 1927, 1960, 74, 87, 99, 2011. We're about 7.5 to 7.6 billion as of mid-2021. We're going to get to about 8 billion people roughly towards the end of this mid to late 2020s. And so that population explosion in humans has had a significant influence on many of these things. So these events have not only influenced people and the fact that people have blown up in terms of numbers, but they shape natural ecosystems and they alter them. So agriculture is a big one, urbanization, what we do with transportation and the burning of fossil fuels, pollution, and the introduction of invasive species away from where they should be to where they're not supposed to be. Okay, and there's a long history in this planet of humans introducing what are called invasive species. So there are four broad divisions of the Earth environment. We've already addressed two of them, the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. We are starting to address the biosphere, which is basically the thin living layer that is in between this layer, the hard rock, and these two layers. Okay, so this is the biology, as it were, that functions within these three. And so if you think about the idea of the biosphere, we said that it's the totality of living organisms on Earth. You had to think about areas where there are strong points, and that would be the tropical rainforests, and areas that are weak, whether it be the deserts or the polar tundra and the ice caps. Think about here you have what are called deficits. There is too much of one thing, but not enough of another. Or there may be multiple things that are lacking. Okay, so whereas strong points, it usually means there is an abundance or overabundance of everything that's needed for what you think of as living organisms and thriving living organisms. So these are the processes that we need to focus on. And for many of you, in fact, probably all of you, this is a review, but it's still important to understand the fact that what is photosynthesis, and it's a key concept, which is broken down into an equation. It's carbon dioxide plus water activated by sun creates what's called a carbohydrate, or better known as a simple sugar, and oxygen. So this solar energy is stored as, a simple sugar. Tropical regions like the Amazon have lots and lots of this going on at all times. Okay. Whereas deserts, what's lacking in the desert? This. Even though you may have plenty of that. So these are places where photosynthesis is active. So the darker green, or the greener it is, the more photosynthesis is happening. So for example, the Amazon, the Congo, the Southeast Asian tropical rainforest. And then you have areas where there's very little going on, like the Sahara, the Atacama Desert here. And notice how close it is to a forest on the other side. So it's sort of the idea of photosynthesis in a more visual way. I prefer the equation way, but if you prefer a more visual, this image right here is, I think, very good. You have solar energy. You have that formula that addressed earlier, CO2 plus H2O in the presence of solar energy creates carbohydrates and oxygen. Think about what happens in New York when we get to the month of October and November. Eventually it gets too cold, so this drops off. And while you may still have water and CO2, there's not enough sunlight, so photosynthesis ends and trees turn yellow and red and orange and brown, and they lose their leaves until the next spring season. Okay? In places like the equatorial regions of the Amazon, this never stops. So it's a continual process of photosynthesis and decomposition and reabsorption of nutrients that's taking place nonstop. The opposite of photosynthesis would be respiration. Respiration is when you take chemical energy that's been stored, remember that sugar, and you basically consume it. So carbohydrate plus oxygen equals CO2, water, and heat energy. Now think about the idea of running late up a stairs for an appointment, and you are running, you're stressed, you're sweating, and you feel hot. Right? You're breathing, so you're expelling CO2, you're sweating, so you are giving off water, and you feel hot, you're giving off energy. You've basically taken all the stored energy in your body, your muscle fibers, and you've breathed rapidly O2, and you've done this. So you have respired. And plants do this as well. Excuse me. So net primary productivity, when you combine these two processes, is the total amount of organic matter or material added to the landscape per year. So it's in kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year. Okay. So, and here's a very simple graphic that shows you MPP for a period, but this could be extrapolated to another time period. Notice where the darker green happens to be. Notice where the very light tan happens to be. Tropical rainforest, deserts. Okay, so it's a very simple geographical relationship. So looking at it all together, photosynthesis, net primary productivity, and respiration. Each of them is limited by physical factors, and these physical factors are limitations and liabilities. They can also be imposed by what are called disturbances, which are basically external to a particular place. And light, temperature, water, wind, landforms, and soil, these are the physical factors that can be in short supply. One of them, two of them, maybe most of them. Okay. And what happens is if you have optimum conditions, you can have an upper threshold where things are really, really, really good, like a tropical rainforest, and you can have a lower threshold, like a desert. And so you get these two different kinds of environments. So in a place like this, like a desert, you can have plenty of sunlight. It might be warm all the time, but what's missing? Water. Here, it might be warm all the time. It might be wet pretty much all the time. And it might be just enough light throughout the year to actually be able to maintain this kind of environment. Whether it be January or June or September or November. It doesn't really matter what time of the year it is. So the idea here is you have a range of optimum conditions and, an area where you have the greatest abundance, where there are few things that are limited. And as you head away from this sort of bell top, what happens is you go from an area of abundance to an area of stress to an area of what's called intolerance. So here the population is great, here the population is low, here the population is either absent or almost absent. Okay, so think about back to this image here. There's an absence of plant life. There is an abundance of plant life here. So this image versus this image falls into the desert one and the forest one. Okay? So a species is limited geographically by the range of environmental factors. And again, those are usually related to temperature and moisture by and large. Those are the big ones, obviously. All right, so climate plays a big role, and we already talked about this, the idea of A climates, C, D, E, and then you have the B climates, which are basically related to moisture. Okay, and remember there's a first letter, a second letter, and a third letter depending on the type of climate. Even in the A climates that are considered tropical and generally wet, a couple of them have a significantly dry season, whereas one is constantly moist. And here's that map from your textbook showing you in a more visual way where these climates tend to be found. And again, these climates are usually tied to a type of pressure system, for example. Think about the global circulation system that we addressed in the weather section of the course. Again, precipitation, where precip tends to be very, very high here in the Amazon, here in the Congo, here in Southeastern Asia. Photoperiod, so the idea of light, and just think about New York. And think about light changes from the month of March to how long the days are in June, to how it looks and feels in September, to how it looks and feels again in terms of daylight when you get to the month of December. Okay? So that makes a big difference. If you live near the equator, your day doesn't really change that much. Your day is roughly 12 hours long, doesn't matter when. But in New York, you know that in December, the sun will be setting by about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Whereas in June, it stays light up until about 9 o'clock at night. So that's a big difference. That makes a big difference in terms of not only day length, but also temperature and then how much you can grow. So your NPP changes much more rapidly in New York throughout the year than it would here near the equator, where light changes are very, very, very subtle. Plant succession, so a change in vegetation that occurs over decades to centuries, although it can be facilitated by something like a fire. So there are two types, primary and secondary. Okay, and secondary is when there's a disturbance that takes place, like a hurricane or a forest fire. So here are some examples how you go from stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, and how it may have been a lake, and then you get some vegetation taking over, lots of sediment accumulation, and then eventually that lake either disappears or becomes very marshy, and other plants come in to take the place. Okay, here's a good example of a human disturbance. This on the left is the Amazon rainforest. This, in the exact same area, is what's happening to the Amazon in many areas. It's being cleared. And it's being cleared for many, many others, many reasons, like, growing, raising cattle and all kinds of farms. And so it makes a big, big difference. Think about the idea of albedo, which we addressed in a previous lesson, much darker, much lighter in color. Think about what that does to reflectivity of light coming in. This on the right is much more reflective than this. Here's plant succession after a forest fire over time. It goes from looking like this to suddenly looking more alive. And oftentimes, fire is a necessary catalyst for things like pine cones to release their seeds. So fire isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's part of the natural process in many places. The only issue is we have introduced human populations in places where nature before didn't have to deal with humans. So as a result, it's become more problematic than it really should be. Let's look at some of the biomes. So again, ecosystem is all the organisms in an area. It's the interaction between those organisms and its association with climate. And ecosystems are influenced by all these things here. So we're going to focus on terrestrial ecosystems, not aquatic ones. Okay. So terrestrial biomes include forests, and these can be tropical, temperate, or pine needle. Savanna or scrub, this is what you find on either side, usually of a tropical rainforest. A grassland, think about the states of Kansas, eastern Colorado, Oklahoma, West Texas, Nebraska would fit this definition. Desert, that's pretty obvious, I hope. And tundra, those are places that are very, very cold and where the ground is usually permanently frozen. Okay? So a biome is what's called a biogeographic unit. And for example, forests are some of the most productive regions in the earth, especially tropical rainforests, which while they only occupy a small percentage of the land, they're responsible for a big chunk of the productivity. So let's look at some of the types and characteristics. And this is from the textbook. And so this little pyramid is pretty useful because the lower you are in the pyramid, the closer to the equator you are, the higher you go, you're the pole. So in New York, we are roughly somewhere in this latitude, and we are roughly here. New York is officially a deciduous forest. If you head north into Canada and Alaska, it is what's called a coniferous or pine needle forest. We're south of that. Okay, so let's look at some of these. So this is just to give you a sense of general distribution, arranged by either decreasing or increasing temperature, depending on where you go on this side, and increasing or decreasing latitude and aridity, meaning dryness. So let's look at the forest biome. First, tropical. So look at the AF, AM, and AW climates. So AF are the ones that are constantly moist. And then you have, of course, deciduous. So a deciduous forest is a forest that loses its leaves. So New York would fit that description to some extent. And this is where we fit. Even though it's showing you Japan, we are the similar type of climate. So we are a mid-latitude forest in New York. Think about when you go to Harriman State Park, or if you go hiking up in Sullivan County, or Ulster County, or Orange County. These are places that are deciduous forests. The only reason you don't see more trees, it's because they've been cleared for agriculture. Okay. This is the pine needle forest. Notice that you find this in Alaska, Canada, Northern Europe, like Scandinavia, and then Russia, Siberia. And this is mostly pine needle forests or evergreens. Here's a savanna, just like the image at the beginning of the course. Notice how there's enough open space, so it's not a forest or a jungle, but there's enough rainfall that it supports some trees. And then you have that distribution there where you see the hash marks. A grassland. This is an image of China, but this could very well be Oklahoma, Colorado, eastern Colorado, West Texas, and so on. Nebraska, North and South Dakota fit the description. Deserts are hopefully pretty obvious, very dry places where there's enough lack of precipitation that very little grows. Remember, deserts do not have to be hot. They can be very, very cold. They just have to be dry. And tundra, so this is a really cool image because this shows you the transition. So the tundra is the tundra because, in fact, let's show you that image. There it is. Because the ground is frozen beneath the surface, so trees cannot establish tree roots. If you go back to this image, there is just enough warmth to support some pine needles. But this is the transition between the taiga and the tundra. So that would be the ET climate. Of course, so if you think about the idea of productivity and climate relationships, so in some places there are no limitations, in some places there are seasonal limitations, and in some places there are permanent limitations. So think about the idea of forests right here. Lots of MPP, very high. The mid-latitudes are somewhere in between. Not quite as high, but definitely not like a desert. And then desert regions have very, very low MPP. So desert regions fit this limitations. Mid-latitude and tropical wet dry climates fit the seasonal limitations category, and tropical rainforests would fit the no limitations category. Let's look at some ecological gradients. A gradient is how something changes in the horizontal. Okay, so let's look at this. The idea of altitude can create a gradient. So this means function. So it's an elevation gradient, how things change as a function of altitude. And here's a great example. This would be the mountain in Africa called Kilimanjaro. It is right near the equator and it is at 19,000 feet. Yet there is snow on top of it because it's so high. So this is a really good example of an elevation gradient. But not very far, you find desert. Here's another example of an elevation gradient. This is a mountain in Arizona, and you go from this sort of scrub environment to a pine needle forest to ice at the very, very top. And here's another example of a mountain with a very low elevation on one side and very, very high mountain near it, where all the moisture gets caught. Remember the whole idea of orographic lifting and the windward side, the rain shadow, all that stuff. It's basically represented here. So that's the lesson. It's pretty straightforward. I think it's, definitely straightforward in the sense of not particularly difficult material, but definitely worth your while in going over. If you have any questions, please get with me. Otherwise, I hope you're doing well, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.